Captain Elias Kane's boots thudded dully against the cold metal floor of the Resolute, his ship of war. The corridor hummed with the energy of the battles that raged across the galaxy, yet inside the command center, everything was eerily quiet. Kane stood before the towering viewport, staring at the black expanse of space, lit only by distant stars and the dying glows of wrecked ships in the distance. His fingers curled around the railing as the weight of his decisions bore down on him. "Sir, the Jarn'kur flagship has withdrawn. Casualties reported on all fronts, but the damage." Kane turned his gaze to Lieutenant Baylor, his second in command, whose face was etched with worry. The man's words trailed off as he saw Kane's expression harden. "They're retreating," Kane said flatly, "but they'll be back." Baylor nodded, his lips pressed thin. "They always come back." They'd been fighting the Jarn'kur for 6 months now. 6 brutal, soul-crushing months of raids, ambushes, and battles that left whole systems devastated. It was all because of one careless, arrogant mistake. The Jarn'kur had fired upon an unarmed human colony ship. They thought it was just another inconsequential action in their conquest across the galaxy. But they didn't know humans. They didn't know Earth. And now, humanity had struck back with a vengeance that even Kane hadn't fully anticipated. "They think we're weak," Kane muttered. "That we're soft because we came from a planet they never bothered to conquer. But that's their first mistake." His eyes darkened. "And their last." The Jarn'kur Dominion had ruled the stars for thousands of years. Their empire spanned across countless systems, their ships equipped with the finest weaponry, and their soldiers bred for combat. They dominated planets with an iron grip, reducing rebellious species to ash before they could even mount a defense. It was a near-universal truth that no one challenged the Jarn'kur and lived. But humanity had never been part of their grand schemes. Earth was considered a backwater planet, its people too primitive, too inconsequential for the great Jarn'kur to bother with. That arrogance would cost them everything. When the Jarn'kur dreadnought Torrent obliterated the human colony ship Endurance, they believed the matter settled. It was just another day for the Dominion, just another primitive race forced to acknowledge their power. But Earth didn't respond with diplomacy, nor did they cower in fear. No, Earth retaliated. Kane had been stationed on Mars when the news came in. The Endurance had been carrying nearly 12,000 people, men, women, and children who were hoping to start a new life on the frontier world of Orion Roman 4. And now they were dust. "Captain," a voice had crackled through his earpiece. "We've lost contact with the Endurance." There was no warning. Kane remembered the cold fury that had settled over him as the reports flowed in. The Jarn'kur had attacked without provocation, without even an attempt at negotiation, and now he was being called back to Earth for a meeting with the Global Defense Council. The council chambers had been filled with the kind of grim energy that only comes before war. Leaders from every major nation on Earth gathered to discuss the response. Some advocated for peace, urging caution against a species as powerful as the Jarn'kur. Others, like Kane, knew that peace was no longer an option. "If we sit idle, they'll do it again," Kane had argued, his voice cutting through the murmur of debate. "And again, the Jarn'kur don't see us as equals. To them, we're just another nuisance to be exterminated." "And what would you have us do, Captain?" one of the council members had asked, her tone weary. "We're outmatched in every way." "Not in every way," Kane had replied. "They've never fought humans. Not like this." Humanity's strength had always been in its resilience, its ability to adapt and survive under the most harrowing conditions. For centuries, Earth had been a breeding ground for conflict, innovation, and perseverance. And now, for the first time in history, humanity was united against a common enemy. The war began with surgical strikes, small human fleets attacking Jarn'kur outposts and supply lines with precision and cunning. The Dominion, initially caught off guard, responded with overwhelming force, sending fleets to crush Earth's rebellious spirit. But for every battle they won, humans seemed to slip through their fingers, reappearing somewhere else with even more devastating tactics. Kane had spearheaded many of these operations, using hit-and-run techniques that the Jarn'kur had never seen before. They were used to crushing their enemies in open combat, not dealing with guerrilla tactics in the vastness of space. It wasn't long before humanity's true advantage revealed itself: unpredictability. Kane's mind snapped back to the present as the Resolute glided through the wreckage of the latest battle. The Dominion had sent another fleet to eliminate them, but once again, human ingenuity had outsmarted them. Kane had used a decoy ship filled with explosives to lure the Jarn'kur into an asteroid field, where they'd been forced into a tight bottleneck. The resulting explosion had torn through their fleet, and now the survivors were limping back to their home systems. "Status report," Kane ordered, turning away from the viewport. His crew sprang into action, checking systems and scanning for survivors. "Minimal damage to the hull," Baylor said after a moment. "Shields held up. We lost 2 fighter squads, but no critical systems." Kane nodded. It was a better outcome than he'd expected. "Any word from Earth?" "Command's impressed," Baylor said with a faint smile. "They didn't think we'd hold this long." "They'll have to do more than be impressed if we want to win this war," Kane replied, his expression grim. "We need an edge." "An edge?" Kane didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the holomap in front of him, watching the blinking indicators that represented the Dominion's remaining forces. "I've been working on something," he said slowly. "Something that might just turn this war around." Baylor raised an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate, sir?" Kane glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not yet, but soon, very soon." It had taken months of planning, but Kane's secret weapon was nearly ready. He'd called in every favor, pulled every string he could, and now the final piece was falling into place. The Jarn'kur thought they were fighting a primitive species. They thought they had the upper hand. But Kane knew something they didn't. Humans had always been survivors, but more than that, they were innovators, and the weapon Kane had helped develop was going to prove it. If it worked, it would change the entire landscape of the war. If it failed, well, Kane wasn't planning on failure. Kane's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of an incoming communication. He tapped the console embedded in his wrist gauntlet, opening the secure channel. The voice on the other end was low, conspiratorial. "Captain Kane, this is Dr. Henning. We're ready." The words sent a ripple of energy down Kane's spine. He had been waiting for this moment. Henning's research was the linchpin, the weapon that would change the course of the war. "Good," Kane said, keeping his voice steady. "I'll be there shortly. Hold your position." The line went dead, leaving Kane to ponder the enormity of what was about to unfold. He turned back toward Baylor, who was watching him intently. "I need to leave," Kane said. "You're in command until I return." "Leave? Sir, we're still vulnerable out here." "The Jarn'kur could send reinforcements any minute," Baylor replied, his brow furrowing in concern. "They won't. Not for a while," Kane reassured him. "We've done enough damage to send them limping back for repairs, but I need to oversee this project personally. Trust me, Lieutenant. This is bigger than anything we've done so far." Baylor hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "Understood, Captain. I'll hold things down here." Kane offered a curt nod in return and made his way to the hangar, his mind focused on the plan ahead. As he boarded the sleek black shuttle that would take him to the secret research facility, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The war had been brutal, but now humanity had a chance to strike back with something truly extraordinary. The shuttle's engines hummed as it broke free from the Resolute's docking clamps and slipped into the void of space, heading for an isolated moon deep within the Orion Nebula. The journey was short but tense, every moment filled with anticipation. Kane stared out the viewport as stars blurred into streaks of light, his thoughts racing ahead of him. Henning's project had been years in the making, a desperate gamble by Earth's brightest minds to create something that could level the playing field against the Jarn'kur. Humanity had always been resourceful, but they needed more than just clever tactics to win this war. They needed something the Dominion couldn't counter, something they wouldn't expect. The facility came into view, hidden within the jagged crags of a moon long forgotten by the galactic powers. To the untrained eye, it looked like little more than a rocky wasteland, devoid of life or purpose. But beneath the surface, deep within the moon's core, was the secret lab where Dr. Henning and his team had been working tirelessly to create a weapon unlike anything seen before. The shuttle landed with a soft thud, and Kane disembarked, greeted by the sterile, metallic corridors of the research base. He strode through the halls, his boots echoing as the tension built inside him. Finally, he reached the reinforced doors of the lab, where Henning stood waiting for him. The scientist was a tall, wiry man with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He gave Kane a tight smile as they shook hands. "You're just in time, Captain." "Let's see it," Kane said, wasting no time with pleasantries. Henning led him through the lab, past rows of computers and holographic displays, until they reached the central chamber. There, suspended in a containment field, was the device that would tip the scales in humanity's favor. It looked unassuming at first glance, a sleek, cylindrical object with glowing blue lines etched across its surface. But Kane knew better. He'd read the reports, seen the simulations. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a game changer. "This is Project Genesis," Henning said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "The culmination of years of research into gravitic manipulation and quantum entanglement. With this, we can fold space itself, disrupt the Jarn'kur ships at the molecular level, and, well, I'll spare you the details. Suffice to say, they won't know what hit them." Kane stepped closer, his eyes locked on the device. "And it works?" Henning nodded. "We've run successful tests on smaller scales. Now, we're ready for the real thing. Once deployed, it will cripple any Jarn'kur fleet within its radius. Their ships will be torn apart before they even know what's happening." A slow smile spread across Kane's face. "Good. We've needed something like this. We're still refining the targeting systems, but it's almost ready," Henning added. "I'd say within the next few days, we can have it operational for field use." "Make it faster," Kane said, his voice firm. "The Jarn'kur won't wait. They'll regroup, and when they do, we need to be ready to strike." Henning's smile faltered, but he nodded. "Understood. I'll push the team harder." As Kane stared at the device, his mind raced with the possibilities. With Project Genesis, they could finally take the fight to the Jarn'kur in a way that would leave the Dominion reeling. This war had cost humanity dearly, but now there was a glimmer of hope, a way to not only survive but to win. "Where do you plan to deploy it first?" Henning asked, breaking Kane's thoughts. "The Jarn'kur homeworld," Kane replied without hesitation. "We hit them where it hurts. Cripple their fleet, destroy their infrastructure. We make them regret ever crossing humanity." Henning blinked in surprise. "That's ambitious." "Ambition is all we have left," Kane said quietly. "And if this works, it'll be the end of the war." Henning nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what was being asked. "We'll make sure it's ready." Kane clapped him on the shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie. "Good. I'll be waiting." Back aboard the Resolute, Kane sat alone in his quarters, the weight of the coming battle pressing down on him. The device was humanity's last hope, but with it came an enormous responsibility. If it worked, they could end the war in a single decisive strike. But if it failed, well, there wouldn't be a second chance. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind wandering to the lives lost in the conflict so far. So many had died for the survival of humanity. Friends, comrades, innocents caught in the crossfire. It was all for this moment, this final gambit. He had to believe it would work. But in war, nothing was ever certain. A soft chime echoed through his quarters, signaling an incoming message. He straightened up, tapping the console to answer. "Captain, this is Baylor. You'll want to hear this." "What is it, Lieutenant?" "There's been a change," Baylor said, his voice tense. "The Jarn'kur have regrouped faster than we anticipated. They're mobilizing a fleet toward the Sol system." Kane's heart skipped a beat. The Jarn'kur were coming for Earth. "How long do we have?" Kane asked, his voice low and steady. 2 weeks at most. 2 weeks, Kane muttered. Not enough time. The device wasn't ready for deployment yet. But they didn't have a choice. They had to act now, or Earth would be destroyed. I'll get the crew ready, Kane said, standing up. We'll meet them head-on. Understood, sir. As the line went dead, Kane's mind churned with the gravity of the situation. 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to finalize Project Genesis. 2 weeks to save Earth. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This time, the fate of humanity rested on his shoulders. The battle preparations aboard the Resolute were a blur of activity. The crew worked with a desperate urgency, knowing that the clock was ticking. Kane moved through the ship with purpose, issuing commands and checking on the readiness of his men. They all knew what was at stake. Earth's survival hung in the balance. In the war room, a holographic map of the Sol system flickered above the central table. Red markers indicated the incoming Jarn'kur fleet, steadily advancing toward Earth. The blue markers representing human ships were pitifully few in comparison. Even with the entire Terran fleet mobilized, they were hopelessly outmatched. But Kane wasn't relying on numbers. He was relying on something far more powerful. Baylor stood at his side, watching the tactical display with a grim expression. It's worse than we thought. The Jarn'kur are sending everything they have. They're not just aiming for Earth, they're going to wipe us out completely. Kane's jaw clenched. He already knew the odds. The Jarn'kur didn't wage wars to conquer, they waged wars to exterminate. Humanity had been a thorn in their side for too long, and now the Dominion was finally bringing its full might to bear. We won't let them, Kane said quietly. His voice was filled with a steely resolve. Project Genesis will be ready, and when it is, we'll turn the tables on them. Baylor glanced at him, uncertainty in his eyes. And if it's not ready in time? Kane didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen if they couldn't deploy the device. The only certainty was that without it, Earth didn't stand a chance. But Kane had never been one to dwell on worst-case scenarios. He believed in action, in finding a way to win, even when victory seemed impossible. Prepare the fleet, Kane ordered. We'll engage them in the outer system, keep them busy. We just need to buy enough time. Understood, Captain. As Baylor moved to relay the orders, Kane turned his attention back to the holographic map. His mind raced, analyzing every possible strategy. The Jarn'kur fleet was massive, a wall of destruction heading straight for the cradle of humanity. But if they could disrupt their formation, hit them with a surprise attack, maybe just maybe they could hold them off long enough for Project Genesis to come online. Underscore 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 2 days passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Every ship in the Terran fleet was mobilized, and the Resolute led the charge. Kane stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen as they exited the shadow of Jupiter's massive bulk and moved into position near the edge of the Sol system. The rest of the fleet fanned out around them, a ragtag collection of warships, freighters retrofitted with weapons, and civilian craft repurposed for battle. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Status report, Kane barked, his voice carrying the weight of command. All ships in position, sir, Baylor replied from his station. We're ready to engage on your command. Kane nodded, his eyes narrowing as the first blips appeared on the long-range sensors. The Jarn'kur were here. A cold knot formed in his stomach, but he forced it down. There was no room for fear now, only action. Open a channel to the fleet, Kane ordered. A moment later, the comms officer nodded, signaling the line was open. Kane took a breath and began speaking. This is Captain Kane. You all know what's coming. The Jarn'kur have sent everything they have, and they mean to end us. But we're not going down without a fight. We've faced impossible odds before, and we've survived. We've bled, we've lost friends, but we're still here. And as long as we're here, we'll make them pay for every inch of space they take. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Today, we hold the line. Not just for ourselves, but for every man, woman, and child on Earth. For humanity. Stand strong. Fight hard. And remember, they started this war. But we're going to finish it." The comms went dead, and the bridge fell into a tense silence. Outside the viewport, the blackness of space seemed to close in, the distant stars like cold, indifferent eyes watching the coming slaughter. Kane tightened his grip on the armrest of his command chair. "Prepare to engage," he ordered, his voice a low growl. The battle erupted in a cacophony of fire and steel. The human fleet surged forward, weapons blazing as they met the Jarn'kur head-on. Laser fire and missile trails crisscrossed the void, ships weaving through the chaos as explosions lit up the darkness. Kane watched the tactical displays, calling out orders with rapid-fire precision. The Jarn'kur ships were larger, more heavily armed, but the humans fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They darted between the enemy vessels, exploiting every weakness, every gap in their formation. The Jarn'kur had numbers, but the humans had cunning. Still, the sheer size of the Jarn'kur fleet was overwhelming. No matter how many ships the Terrans took down, more seemed to pour in from the fringes of the system. Kane could see the inevitable unfolding before him, but he refused to accept it. He refused to give in. "How's Genesis coming?" Kane demanded, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. "Dr. Henning reports they're making progress, but it's still not ready," Baylor replied, his voice strained. Kane slammed his fist down on the armrest. "They'd better hurry, or there won't be anything left to save." An explosion rocked the ship, sending a tremor through the hull. Kane gripped the arms of his chair, steadying himself as alarms blared across the bridge. "Damage report," he shouted. "Hull breach on deck 3, but we're holding," one of the officers replied. "Shields are at 60%. Kane cursed under his breath. They were holding the line, but just barely. Every minute felt like an eternity, the Jarn'kur pressing their advantage with relentless precision. The human fleet was being torn apart, and the worst part was, Kane knew there was little he could do about it. But then, something changed. A new blip appeared on the sensors, moving fast, too fast. "Captain," Baylor shouted, "we've got an inbound vessel on a collision course." Kane's eyes flicked to the screen. The vessel was small, almost too small to be picked up by their sensors, but it was moving with terrifying speed, heading straight for the Resolute. "Evasive maneuvers," Kane barked. "Get us out of its path." The helmsman yanked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp roll. But it was too late. The incoming vessel slammed into the side of the Resolute with the force of a battering ram. The ship shuddered violently, and the lights flickered as systems struggled to compensate. "We've been hit," Baylor shouted. "Hull integrity is failing." Kane's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment he had dreaded. The Jarn'kur had sent a suicide ship straight into their flagship. If they didn't act fast, the Resolute would be lost. "Seal off the damaged sections," Kane ordered. "Divert all power to the shields. We're not going down yet." The crew scrambled to follow his commands, working furiously to stabilize the ship. Kane could feel the heat rising in his chest, a mixture of anger and fear. They were so close to victory, but the Jarn'kur weren't giving them the time they needed. Down in the engineering bay, the sound of alarms blared over the chaos. Dr. Henning stood over the control console, his hands moving in a blur as he adjusted the settings on the Genesis device. Sweat poured down his face, and his heart raced as the countdown ticked closer to 0. Come on," he muttered under his breath. The device was nearly ready, but they were running out of time. If they didn't deploy it soon, the ship and the entire Terran fleet would be obliterated. One of the engineers ran up to him, panic in his eyes. "Doctor, the ship's been hit. We've lost power to the primary containment field." Henning's blood ran cold. Without the containment field, the Genesis device was too unstable to activate. If they tried to use it now, it could destroy them all. The lights flickered in the engineering bay as the impact of the Jarn'kur vessel reverberated through the ship. Dr. Henning's heart pounded as he stared at the flickering readings on the Genesis console. Sweat dripped down his brow, the pressure mounting by the second. Without the containment field, this whole thing is a bomb. The engineer next to him shouted, panic seeping into his voice. Henning bit his lip, his mind racing through the possibilities. Every part of him wanted to call off the activation and abort the mission. But calling it off meant one thing: the end of Earth, the end of humanity. No, not today. Isolate the malfunctioning nodes, Henning barked, his voice cracking through the chaos. We'll bypass the containment field. That's suicide, the engineer protested. The feedback loop alone could. Just do it, Henning cut him off, his eyes blazing. We either take this risk, or we're all dead anyway. The engineer nodded, swallowing his fear as he began working on the control panels. Henning stepped up to the console, his hands flying over the keys as he recalibrated the power distribution. He could feel the tremors through the floor as the ship took more hits. They didn't have much time. Give me all available power from non-essential systems, Henning ordered. We've already diverted everything we can spare, came the reply from the comms. Then divert from life support, Henning shot back. We'll suffocate slower than we'll die if we don't stop them. Back on the bridge, Kane gripped his chair as the Resolute bucked beneath another barrage of enemy fire. The situation was getting worse by the second. Damage reports were pouring in from all over the ship, and the Jarn'kur weren't letting up. Captain, we're not going to last much longer like this, Baylor said, his voice grim. Shields are down to 20%, and our hulls barely holding together. Kane glanced at the tactical map. The human fleet was falling apart. Ships were being torn to pieces all around them. But they'd bought some time. He just hoped it was enough. Henning, Kane growled into the comms. How's Genesis coming? We're almost ready, Captain, Henning's voice crackled back. Just a few more minutes. You don't have a few more minutes, Kane snapped. We're losing ships left and right out here. I know, but this thing's a precision instrument, not a blaster. If we don't get the settings right, we'll fry half the system. Kane's fist clenched, but he forced himself to take a breath. He trusted Henning. The man was a genius. He'd pulled off miracles before. Kane just prayed he had one more left in him. Do what you have to, Kane said. We'll hold them off as long as we can. The next wave of Jarn'kur ships descended on the human fleet like predators sensing blood in the water. Their sleek, insectoid vessels wove through the battlefield with deadly precision, tearing through human defenses. Explosions flared as more human ships were lost, but Kane's fleet refused to break. On the Resolute, the tension was palpable. The ship's crew worked tirelessly, their faces pale but determined. They all knew the odds, knew that this might be the last fight they'd ever face. But if they were going down, they were going down fighting. Captain, Baylor called out, his voice cutting through the din. We've got a breach in the aft section. We're losing atmosphere. Kane cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. He could feel it, the end was near. But he wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Seal it off, he ordered. We just need to hold on a little longer. Another explosion rocked the ship, sending sparks flying across the bridge. The lights flickered, and Kane could hear the groan of the ship's hull as it struggled to hold together. Henning, where the hell are you with Genesis? Kane shouted into the comms. Just a few more seconds, Henning's voice crackled back. In the engineering bay, Henning's hand shook as he made the final adjustments. The Genesis device hummed ominously, its power levels spiking dangerously as he rerouted the last of the ship's energy reserves into it. Sweat poured down his face, and his heart pounded in his chest. Come on, he muttered under his breath. The engineer next to him glanced up, fear in his eyes. Doctor, the core's overheating, if we don't stabilize it. There's no time, Henning snapped. We either fire this thing now, or we're all dead anyway. The engineer hesitated, but Henning's determination won out. He keyed in the final sequence, his hands moving in a blur. Genesis is ready, he shouted into the comms. On the bridge, Kane's heart leapt as Henning's voice came through. But there was no time to celebrate. "Activate it," Kane ordered, his voice sharp. "Now." In the engineering bay, Henning slammed his hand down on the activation console. The Genesis device roared to life, the hum of its power filling the room with a deep, resonant thrum. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the device began to pulse, sending out a wave of distortion that rippled through the fabric of space. For a moment, nothing happened. The battlefield remained the same, ships firing, explosions lighting up the void. But then, slowly, the Jarn'kur ships began to falter. Their movements became sluggish, their weapons' fire growing erratic. And then, one by one, they stopped. On the bridge of the Resolute, Kane watched in awe as the Jarn'kur fleet seemed to freeze in place. Their ships drifted, their weapons silent. It was as if the entire fleet had been paralyzed, locked in some kind of stasis. "It's working," Baylor whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's actually working." Kane let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The Genesis device had done it. It had neutralized the Jarn'kur fleet without firing a single shot. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the human fleet wasn't under fire. They had a moment to breathe. But Kane knew it wasn't over yet. "Status report," Kane ordered, his voice steady. "The Jarn'kur ships are completely disabled," Baylor replied, still in shock. They're just sitting there." Kane nodded, his mind already racing. The Genesis device had bought them time, but it wasn't a permanent solution. The Jarn'kur would recover eventually, and when they did, they'd come back with a vengeance. They needed to act fast. "Prep the boarding teams," Kane ordered. "We're not done yet." Baylor looked at him, confusion in his eyes. "Boarding teams? What are we?" "We're taking the fight to them," Kane said, his voice hard. "If we're going to end this war, we need to hit them where it hurts." The silence that followed the Genesis device's activation was eerie. The Jarn'kur fleet, once a chaotic storm of death and destruction, now floated helplessly in space, their ships dead in the water. But Kane knew better than to trust the calm. "Prepare for boarding," Kane repeated, more urgently this time. "We're not letting this chance slip by." The bridge crew moved with renewed energy, their exhaustion replaced by determination. For the first time in days, they weren't just surviving, they were going on the offensive. Baylor stepped up beside Kane, his eyes scanning the frozen battlefield. "Captain, if we board those ships, we're heading straight into the lion's den. We don't know how long Genesis will hold them." Kane nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know the risks, but this is our best shot. If we destroy their command structure now, we might just cripple them for good." Baylor hesitated, then nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're talking about their war leaders." "Their queen." "Baylor," Kane corrected. "Take out their queen, and the swarm falls apart. They're too hive-minded to function without her." It was a risky gamble, but Kane had no other option. If the humans didn't strike now, while the Jarn'kur were vulnerable, they'd never get another chance. They needed to decapitate the enemy leadership, or Earth was finished. "Get the strike team ready," Kane ordered. "I'm leading this one." The boarding team assembled in the docking bay, their faces grim but resolute. These were Earth's finest hardened soldiers who'd seen the worst of the war and lived to tell the tale. Their armor was scuffed, their weapons well worn, but their eyes burned with the same fire that Kane felt in his chest. As Kane strapped on his combat gear, Henning's voice crackled through his comms. "Captain, Genesis is holding for now, but we're seeing fluctuations in the field. The Jarn'kur might start regaining control sooner than we thought." Kane cursed under his breath. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say," Henning replied. "Maybe an hour, maybe less." It wasn't enough time, but it would have to do. Kane checked his rifle one last time and turned to his men. They were ready. No speeches were needed. "Let's move out." The team boarded one of the smaller, disabled Jarn'kur ships first, their entry breaching its airlock with a controlled explosion. Kane's boots hit the alien metal with a heavy thud as the team fanned out, weapons raised. The air inside the ship was thick and humid, a stark contrast to the sterile cold of space. It reeked of the Jarn'kur's strange, pheromone-laden atmosphere. The interior of the ship was a twisted maze of organic-looking walls, pulsating with dim, bioluminescent light. The architecture was alien, disorienting, but Kane kept his focus sharp. He knew what they were looking for, the ship's command center. If they could take out the officers aboard this ship, it would disrupt the Jarn'kur's coordination. They moved quickly and silently through the corridors, their every step muffled by the thick, almost fleshy surface beneath their feet. It felt like they were walking inside a living organism, and in a way, they were. The Jarn'kur ships were biomechanical, grown as much as they were built. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Kane's eye. He signaled for the team to halt, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, then another. "Contacts," Kane whispered into his comms. "Stay sharp." A tense silence followed as the team moved forward, eyes scanning the darkened corridors. The Jarn'kur might be frozen, but Kane wasn't taking any chances. If even one of them had regained control, it could mean disaster. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of Jarn'kur warriors, their spindly limbs locked in place by Genesis. Kane's breath caught in his throat. Even immobilized, the Jarn'kur were terrifying insectoid creatures with multi-jointed arms, sharp mandibles, and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. "They're still frozen," Baylor whispered, stepping up beside Kane. "For now," Kane muttered. "Keep moving." They pushed deeper into the ship, navigating its labyrinthine corridors until they reached a large chamber that Kane recognized as the command center. The room was filled with strange, pulsating equipment, organic consoles manned by more Jarn'kur warriors. At the center of it all was a massive throne-like structure, and seated upon it was their target, a Jarn'kur commander. The creature was larger than the others, its body encased in chitinous armor, its eyes glowing with a cold, calculating light. Even frozen by Genesis, it radiated power. Kane could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him. "That's the one," Kane said, his voice low. "Take it out." Baylor raised his weapon, but just as his fingers squeezed the trigger, the commander's eyes flickered. There was a split second of movement, a twitch of the mandibles, the subtle shifting of limbs. "Genesis is failing," Kane shouted, diving for cover as the Jarn'kur warriors suddenly sprang to life. The room erupted into chaos as the Jarn'kur broke free from their paralysis, their alien screams echoing through the chamber. Kane rolled behind a console, his rifle barking as he fired at the closest Jarn'kur soldier. The creature crumpled to the ground, its exoskeleton shattered, but more were already closing in. "Fall back," Kane ordered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. The team scrambled for cover, exchanging fire with the Jarn'kur as they fought their way back through the corridors. The ship was waking up around them, its systems reactivating, its warriors swarming from every direction. The Genesis field was collapsing, and they were trapped deep inside enemy territory. "We're not going to make it at this rate," Baylor shouted, his rifle blazing as he gunned down another Jarn'kur. Kane gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They couldn't afford to get bogged down in a firefight. They needed to complete the mission or die trying. "Push forward," Kane roared. "We're taking that commander out, no matter what." He charged back into the command center, his heart pounding in his chest. The Jarn'kur commander was already barking orders to its subordinates, its mandibles clicking as it directed the assault. Kane knew that if he didn't take it out now, the entire mission would be a failure. With a surge of adrenaline, Kane vaulted over a console, firing his rifle point-blank at the Jarn'kur commander. The creature staggered, its armor cracking under the barrage, but it wasn't down yet. It turned its cold, alien eyes on Kane, its mandibles twitching in what he could only interpret as a sneer. "Not today," Kane growled, pulling the trigger one last time. The bullet pierced the Jarn'kur commander's skull, and the creature collapsed to the ground in a heap. "Commander's down," Kane shouted into his comms. "Now let's get the hell out of here." Kane and his team didn't have time to celebrate the kill. The Jarn'kur warriors were still flooding the corridors, their insectoid limbs clattering against the ship's organic walls as they advanced. The commander's death might have disoriented them, but the hive was still strong and angry. "We're not out of this yet," Baylor grunted as he reloaded his weapon, his eyes scanning the chaotic battlefield. "What's the plan, Kane?" Kane wiped sweat from his brow, his heart still hammering in his chest. "We move fast and hard, make it back to the docking bay, grab whatever intel we can, and blow this place." Baylor smirked, a grim determination lighting his features. "Just another day in the office, huh?" "Something like that," Kane muttered, nodding to the rest of the team. "Let's move." The team surged forward through the alien ship, fighting their way through the increasingly disorganized Jarn'kur. The Genesis device had clearly done more damage to the hive mind than expected. Without their commander's direct influence, the warriors were less coordinated, their attacks sloppy, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. Kane led the charge, his rifle blazing as he cut down Jarn'kur soldiers left and right. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. He couldn't afford to make mistakes, not now. Baylor and the rest of the team followed closely, covering Kane's flanks as they pushed toward their extraction point. But as they rounded a corner, a massive blast rocked the ship, sending them sprawling to the ground. "What the hell was that?" Baylor growled, shaking his head as he clambered back to his feet. Kane's ears were ringing, but he forced himself to focus. "That wasn't us." Another explosion followed, this one even closer. The walls of the ship groaned under the pressure, and the air began to take on an acrid, burning smell. Kane glanced at Baylor, his stomach sinking as the realization dawned on him. "They're trying to scuttle the ship," Kane said, his voice grim. "They'd rather blow it up than let us take anything useful." "Of course they would," Baylor replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why make this easy?" Kane's mind raced. If the Jarn'kur were willing to destroy their own ship, they were running out of time fast. They couldn't afford to be here when the ship detonated. "Forget the intel," Kane said through clenched teeth. "We're getting out of here." The team moved with renewed urgency, sprinting through the twisting corridors of the ship as the explosions grew more frequent. Every step they took was a gamble, with the ship threatening to tear itself apart at any moment. Kane could feel the heat rising, the walls shaking as the ship's internal systems overloaded. "Captain, we've got a problem," Henning's voice crackled over the comms. "We're picking up increased energy readings from the Jarn'kur fleet. They're powering up weapons." Kane's blood ran cold. "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less," Henning replied. "We need you back on the Resolute now." Kane cursed under his breath. "We're on our way, Henning. Just keep the ship ready." He didn't have to explain to the team. They already knew what was at stake. With grim resolve, they pressed forward, their boots pounding against the alien surface beneath them. The ship's organic walls pulsed with eerie, bioluminescent light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the flickering explosions. As they neared the docking bay, a massive bulkhead slammed shut in front of them, blocking their path. Kane's heart sank. The Jarn'kur were trying to trap them inside. "Find another route," Kane barked, but his voice was barely audible over the deafening roar of another explosion. Baylor was already at work, scanning the surrounding walls for any sign of an access point. "There's got to be a maintenance tunnel or something." "We don't have time for something," Kane snapped, his frustration boiling over. But just as the team began to lose hope, Baylor's hand brushed against a hidden panel in the wall. It hissed open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit tunnel that led back toward the docking bay. "It's not exactly spacious," Baylor said with a grimace, "but it'll get us where we need to go." Kane nodded, motioning for the team to move. They ducked into the tunnel one by one, their breaths coming in short, panicked bursts as the walls seemed to close in around them. The tunnel was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for a single person, and every step they took felt like a battle against the oppressive weight of the ship's collapsing structure. As they crawled through the narrow passage, the temperature continued to rise, sweat dripping down Kane's face. The ship was coming apart at the seams, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "We're almost there," Baylor called from the front of the line, his voice strained. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into the docking bay. The Resolute was waiting for them, its engines already humming with readiness. But the sight that greeted them in the bay wasn't what Kane had hoped for. Dozens of Jarn'kur warriors swarmed the area, their multi-jointed limbs skittering across the floor as they frantically tried to board the human ship. Kane raised his rifle without hesitation. "Take them out, now." The team opened fire, their weapons cutting through the alien horde with brutal efficiency. Kane led the charge toward the Resolute, his heart pounding in his chest as he fired shot after shot. The Jarn'kur, disoriented by the loss of their commander, were no match for the seasoned human soldiers. But just as they neared the boarding ramp, a deafening explosion rocked the bay. The Jarn'kur ship was collapsing around them, its internal systems failing one by one. Kane could feel the heat at his back as the ship's core began to overload. "We're out of time," Baylor shouted over the comms. "Get aboard," Kane yelled, pushing the team forward as the walls of the bay began to buckle. They sprinted up the ramp, their boots pounding against the metal as they scrambled into the Resolute. As soon as the last soldier was aboard, Kane slammed his hand against the door controls, sealing the ship from the outside world. "Go, Henning," Kane barked into the comms. The Resolute's engines roared to life, and the ship lurched forward, pulling away from the Jarn'kur vessel just as it began to implode. Kane watched from the viewport as the alien ship crumpled in on itself, a massive fireball consuming its remains. The rest of the Jarn'kur fleet, sensing the loss of their hive structure, scattered in disarray. For the first time in days, Kane allowed himself a breath of relief. "We did it," Baylor said, his voice weary but triumphant. Kane nodded, his gaze still locked on the wreckage of the Jarn'kur ship. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but this war isn't over. Not by a long shot." The Resolute cut through the debris field like a predator on the hunt. Kane stood by the bridge's viewport, his eyes fixed on the stars outside. The fiery remains of the Jarn'kur vessel had faded, but the weight of their narrow escape still hung heavy in the air. Henning adjusted controls at his console, a frown etched on his face. "We got out of there by the skin of our teeth. If the Jarn'kur had been just a little quicker—" "But they weren't," Baylor interjected, slapping Henning on the back. "And that's all that matters. We're alive, and their ship is space dust." Kane remained silent. Victory should have felt sweeter, but something gnawed at him. His mind kept replaying the chaos on the Jarn'kur ship. The explosion, the disarray in their forces, the near collapse of their hive mind. The Genesis device had worked too well. It wasn't supposed to cause that much devastation. There was something more to it, something they hadn't accounted for. "We're not out of this yet," Kane finally said, breaking the silence. "That wasn't the whole Jarn'kur fleet, and if what we've seen so far is any indication, they'll be coming for us with everything they've got." Henning looked up from his station, worry flashing across his face. "You think they'll launch a counterattack?" "They'd be fools not to," Kane said, his voice hard. "We took down one of their command ships and nearly tore apart their hive network in the process. They'll regroup, consolidate, and strike back. Hard." Baylor grunted, leaning against the bulkhead. "So what's the plan, boss? We can't keep running forever." "We won't," Kane said, his jaw tightened. "But we need to be smarter. The Genesis device did more than we expected. It hit them where it hurts, but we didn't get the data we came for. Without that, we're flying blind. We need to figure out exactly what we're up against." Henning's fingers danced across his console as he pulled up data from their sensors. "We did manage to grab some readings before the ship went down. The core systems were starting to overload when we left, but I picked up something strange just before we lost contact." Kane moved closer to Henning's station, his interest piqued. "What kind of strange?" There was a burst of encrypted signals right before the Jarn'kur ship started to implode. It wasn't coming from the ship itself, though more like it was routed through it. Baylor frowned. You're saying someone else was controlling the Jarn'kur, some other force behind the hive? Henning shook his head. Not controlling, but definitely influencing. It's hard to say exactly what it was without more data, but it could explain why the Genesis device had such an extreme effect. We might have triggered something deeper in their network, something they were trying to hide. Kane's mind raced. If Henning was right, it meant they weren't just dealing with the Jarn'kur anymore. There was another player in this game, someone who had their claws deep in the hive systems, and if the Genesis device had exposed them, it meant the humans had inadvertently stumbled upon something far more dangerous. "Can you track the signal?" Kane asked, his tone urgent. Henning nodded slowly. "I can try. It'll take some time to decrypt the data, but I think I can trace it back to its source." "Do it," Kane ordered, "and get it done fast. We're running out of time." The ship's engines hummed in the background as the hours ticked by. The crew was on edge, the tension palpable. Kane paced the bridge, his mind working through a dozen different scenarios. If the Jarn'kur weren't acting alone, then who or what was pulling their strings? A sharp beep from Henning's console broke the silence. "I've got something," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and dread. Kane moved to his side, looking over the streams of data flowing across the screen. "What is it?" Henning pointed to a series of coordinates that blinked into view. "That signal I picked up, it's not just a random burst. It's part of a larger network. I've traced it back to a system on the edge of known space. Looks like a remote outpost, deep in Jarn'kur territory." Baylor's brow furrowed. Why would the Jarn'kur have a base that far out? They usually stay within their core systems. Kane's gut twisted. Maybe it's not a Jarn'kur base. Baylor's eyes widened in understanding. "You think whoever's pulling the strings is operating from out there?" Kane nodded. "It's a possibility. If the Jarn'kur are being influenced by an outside force, they'd need a remote location to avoid detection. This could be the key to understanding what we're really up against." Henning swiveled in his chair to face Kane. "So what's the move, Captain? Do we investigate?" Kane didn't hesitate. "We head to the coordinates. If there's something out there, we need to find it before the Jarn'kur regroup and hit us with everything they've got." Baylor smirked, clearly relishing the idea of another fight. "About time we got back on the offensive." "Let's just hope we're ready for what we find," Kane muttered under his breath. The journey to the remote system was uneventful, but the air aboard the Resolute remained thick with anticipation. As they approached the coordinates, the tension on the bridge spiked. Henning worked his console, his face a mask of concentration. "I'm picking up some faint energy signatures, but nothing conclusive. Whatever's out here, it's well hidden." "Keep scanning," Kane ordered. "We're not leaving until we find it." Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The stars outside the viewport seemed to blur as the ship drifted deeper into the uncharted system. Then, without warning, Henning's console erupted in a series of shrill beeps. "Got something," he shouted, his fingers flying across the controls. "It's faint, but there's definitely a structure out here. Looks like a station heavily shielded, but I've got a lock on its location." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Bring it up on the screen." The main display flickered to life, revealing a distant object shrouded in darkness. It was massive, its angular design starkly different from the organic curves of Jarn'kur architecture. The structure seemed to pulse with an eerie, subdued light, as if it were alive. "That's no Jarn'kur outpost," Baylor said, his voice low with awe. Kane clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We need to get closer. If that station's controlling the Jarn'kur, it's the key to ending this war." As the Resolute inched toward the station, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The station was too quiet, too still. And yet, there was something about it that set his nerves on edge, a sense of malevolence that lurked just beneath the surface. "Stay sharp," Kane said, his voice grim. "We don't know what we're dealing with." The Resolute glided through the void, approaching the mysterious station with a cautious determination. The closer they got, the more unsettling the structure became. Its surface wasn't just made of metal. There were layers that seemed to ripple, as though the material itself was organic, shifting ever so slightly under their gaze. Kane stood rigid by the viewport, eyes locked on the station. "Henning, any life signs?" Henning tapped at his console, his face tightening as he scanned. "Nothing definitive, Captain. No Jarn'kur life signs, but there's something else. I'm getting faint readings, intermittent, like it's hiding," Kane finished. His gut told him there was something alive in that station. It wasn't human, and it wasn't Jarn'kur. Baylor grunted. "If it's hiding, it knows we're here." "Prepare for boarding," Kane ordered, his voice hard. "I want a full team suited up and ready. We're going in." The order sent a ripple of activity through the ship. Kane's crew, hardened by months of skirmishes with the Jarn'kur, moved with grim efficiency. Baylor barked commands at his soldiers, their weapons gleaming under the harsh lights of the armory. Henning remained at his console, eyes fixed on the station as they drew closer. "Captain," Henning said, his voice strained, "there's something else. The station is powered by an energy source I can't identify. It's alien, unlike anything I've seen before." Kane frowned. "Can you isolate it?" "I'm trying, but whatever it is, it's masked. This whole place is one giant anomaly." Kane gritted his teeth. "We'll figure it out when we get in there. For now, keep scanning. I want to know if anything moves before we do." Baylor appeared beside Kane, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Team's ready, Captain. What's the plan?" "We board, search the station, and retrieve any intel we can. If there's something controlling the Jarn'kur, we need to find it and destroy it." The boarding craft shuddered as it docked with the station. Kane, Baylor, and their squad of Marines moved with purpose, their boots echoing off the cold, metallic surface of the docking bay. The air was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the structure sent a chill down their spines. The station was dark, save for the faint pulses of light that flickered sporadically along the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance as they advanced. "Stay sharp," Kane whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We don't know what's in here." They moved deeper into the station, passing through narrow corridors lined with strange, pulsating cables. The architecture was unlike anything Kane had seen before, a blend of mechanical and organic elements that made his skin crawl. "This place feels wrong," Baylor muttered, his voice low, "like it's alive." Kane nodded, his eyes scanning the walls. "Whatever built this place, it wasn't the Jarn'kur. This is something else." As they reached a large central chamber, Henning's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, I'm picking up something on the scanners. It's faint, but it's moving, and it's headed your way." Kane's heart pounded in his chest. "Everyone, get ready." The squad spread out, taking cover behind pillars and bulkheads, weapons trained on the entrance to the chamber. For a moment, there was only silence, the oppressive weight of the station pressing down on them. Then, a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. Kane's pulse quickened. "Eyes up. We've got company." The shadows at the far end of the chamber shifted, and something moved in the darkness. It was large, its form obscured by the flickering light. Kane could make out the glint of metal, but there was something off about it. "Henning," Kane hissed into his comms. "What the hell am I looking at?" I don't know," Henning replied, his voice shaken. "It's not Jarn'kur. I can't get a clear reading." The creature stepped into the light, and Kane's blood ran cold. It was an amalgamation of metal and flesh, its body twisted and grotesque. Mechanical limbs jutted from its torso, while its head, if it could even be called that, was a mass of wires and cables that pulsed with a sickly green light. "What the hell is that thing?" Baylor growled, raising his rifle. "I don't know," Kane whispered, his finger hovering over the trigger. "But it's not friendly." The creature let out a deafening roar, and without warning, it charged. "Open fire!" Kane shouted. The chamber erupted in gunfire as the squad unleashed a hail of bullets on the creature. But the thing was faster than something of its size had any right to be. It weaved through the barrage of bullets, its mechanical limbs whirring as it closed the distance. Baylor let out a battle cry, stepping forward to meet the creature head-on. His rifle spat out rounds, each one slamming into the creature's hide. But it barely slowed. The thing swung one of its massive limbs, sending Baylor crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. "Baylor!" Kane shouted, but there was no time to check on him. The creature was nearly on top of them. Kane fired his rifle, aiming for the pulsating mass of wires at the creature's head. The bullets struck home, and the thing let out a high-pitched screech, stumbling back. But it wasn't enough. "Fall back," Kane ordered, grabbing Baylor by the arm and dragging him toward the corridor. The squad retreated, firing as they went. The creature pursued, its roars echoing through the station as it tore through bulkheads and walls in its path. They made it back to the docking bay, the doors slamming shut behind them. Kane breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. Henning's voice came over the comms, panicked. "Captain, we've got a problem. The station, it's powering up. Whatever you did in there, it triggered something." Kane's heart sank. "What do you mean, powering up?" "The energy readings are spiking. I think the whole station is a weapon." The Resolute's docking bay thrummed with the intensity of the energy building up inside the station. Kane stood frozen for a second, Henning's words echoing in his mind. "A weapon? How powerful?" Kane demanded. "Catastrophic," Henning answered, his voice tense. "If we don't get out of here now, it'll vaporize everything within 100,000 kilometers." Baylor groaned beside Kane, shaking his head as he pulled himself upright. "Captain, we need to blow this place up before it can do that." Kane's mind raced. The creature, the weird, organic structure of the station. And now this everything pointed to something far beyond the Jarn'kur's capability. They'd stumbled into something ancient, something dangerous, and it was about to obliterate them. "Henning, get the ship ready to leave, now. We're coming back to the Resolute," Kane barked into his comms. But as they turned to board the ship, the floor beneath their feet vibrated. Lights along the walls flared to life, a row of strange symbols and pathways leading deep into the station. "Wait," Baylor grabbed Kane's arm. "If this station is powering up, then there's a control center somewhere. We can stop this." Kane hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every second they delayed, the station's energy surged higher. But abandoning this place without shutting it down could doom entire star systems if the weapon activated. "Henning," Kane said, his voice grim, "we're going to find the control center and shut this thing down. Buy us as much time as you can." "Understood, Captain." "But don't take too long," Henning replied, his voice tight with worry. Kane nodded to Baylor. "Lead the way." They moved quickly, following the strange pathways deeper into the heart of the station. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the alien symbols glowing brighter with each step they took. It was as if the station was alive, guiding them to its core. "This place is a trap," Baylor muttered, his eyes darting around. Whatever built it, they knew what they were doing. Kane said nothing, his mind focused on the task at hand. The control center had to be close. If they could disable the weapon, they'd save millions of lives. But something nagged at him, a feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. As they reached a large, circular chamber, Kane's eyes widened. In the center of the room was a massive, glowing sphere, suspended in midair by thin tendrils of energy. The sphere pulsed with power, and Kane could feel the heat radiating off it, even from across the room. "That's it," Baylor said, his voice low. "That's the heart of the station." Kane approached the sphere cautiously, his hand hovering over the controls at the base. The symbols etched into the console were unfamiliar, but they bore a striking resemblance to those they had seen on the walls. "Can you shut it down?" Baylor asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. Kane studied the console, his mind racing. The symbols were strange, but he recognized enough to make an educated guess. He reached out and pressed a series of buttons, hoping he was right. The sphere flared brighter for a moment, then dimmed. The energy in the room seemed to hum, as though the station itself was reacting to Kane's actions. "I think it's working," Kane said, his voice tense. "We just need to." A deafening roar interrupted him. Kane spun around to see the creature from before, larger and angrier than ever, barreling into the chamber. Baylor cursed, raising his rifle. "It's back." The creature charged, its mechanical limbs slashing through the air with terrifying speed. Kane dove out of the way, narrowly avoiding one of its claws. He fired his rifle, the bullets sparking off the creature's armored hide. "Keep it away from the console," Kane shouted, scrambling to his feet. Baylor grunted in response, unloading round after round into the creature. But it was relentless, shrugging off the bullets as it advanced. Kane rushed back to the console, frantically pressing more buttons. The sphere pulsed again, flickering as the energy within it began to destabilize. "We don't have much time," Kane shouted, his voice strained. The creature let out another roar and lunged at Baylor, knocking him to the ground. Kane's heart skipped a beat as he watched his friend struggle beneath the massive creature. With a desperate cry, Kane grabbed a nearby piece of debris and slammed it into the creature's back. It screeched in pain, its attention momentarily diverted. Baylor seized the opportunity and rolled out from under it, gasping for breath. "Thanks," Baylor wheezed, grabbing his rifle. Kane nodded, his mind racing. They couldn't keep fighting this thing forever. The station's weapon was seconds away from activating, and the creature wasn't going to let them disable it. "Baylor," Kane shouted over the chaos, "we need to overload the system. Blow the whole thing." Baylor's eyes widened in realization. "Are you crazy? We'll never make it out alive." "We don't have a choice." Kane fired another shot at the creature, keeping it at bay. "It's either this, or the entire sector gets wiped out." Baylor hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Fine, but you owe me a drink when this is over." Kane grinned, even as the creature lunged at them again. "Deal." He turned back to the console, rapidly inputting commands. The sphere began to glow brighter, the energy within it becoming unstable. The walls of the chamber trembled as the station systems went into overdrive. "Get ready to run," Kane shouted, his heart pounding. Baylor fired one last shot at the creature before sprinting toward the exit. Kane followed close behind, the chamber collapsing around them as the station's core overloaded. They raced through the corridors, the walls shaking and sparks flying as the station began to tear itself apart. Behind them, the creature let out one final, anguished roar before being consumed by the explosion. As they reached the docking bay, the door to the Resolute slid open, and Henning's voice crackled over the comms. "Get in, now." Kane and Baylor dove into the ship just as the docking bay behind them exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The Resolute lurched forward, its engines roaring to life as it sped away from the collapsing station. Kane collapsed into his seat, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "Status, Henning." Henning's voice came through, filled with relief. "We're clear, Captain. The station, it's gone." Kane closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. "Good." Baylor slumped into the seat next to him, grinning despite the pain. "You really know how to make an exit, Kane." Kane chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's get home." Kane sat in the command chair of the Resolute, the glow of the control panels casting a soft light across the bridge. Outside the viewport, the stars streaked by as the ship sped away from the ruined station, leaving the chaos behind. But Kane's mind was far from at ease. The creature, the weapon, the station itself, they had barely escaped with their lives, and the implications of what they'd found weighed heavily on him. "We need to report this," Henning said, breaking the silence. "Command needs to know what we encountered out there." Kane nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the swirling void of space ahead of them. "They will, but I doubt anyone's going to believe it." He chuckled bitterly. "A station older than anything we've ever seen, with technology that shouldn't exist, a creature that defies biology and cybernetics, and a weapon capable of wiping out entire systems." He shook his head. If we hadn't seen it ourselves, I wouldn't believe it either. Baylor, nursing a bruise on his arm, leaned back in his chair and smirked. Well, we've got the logs. We've got the footage. Let them try and deny it. Kane glanced at him. Footage? Baylor gestured to his helmet. The whole time, Kane. Everything we saw, it's all recorded. I may not know much about alien tech, but I know enough to keep a good record of anything that tries to kill me. Henning's face lit up. That's actually brilliant. We have proof. Kane sat back, his mind easing slightly at the thought. Proof. Maybe this would lead to some answers. Maybe someone higher up would know what they'd stumbled upon, or at least how to deal with it in the future. But even as he considered it, a part of him knew the truth. They'd only scratched the surface of something far bigger. The station's destruction hadn't ended the threat, it had merely postponed it. We still don't know who built that station, Kane said, his voice low. Or why. And I have a feeling that whatever that thing was, it wasn't acting alone. There's more out there. Baylor groaned. Great. More nightmares to look forward to. Henning chimed in, his voice filled with unease. It makes sense, though. A weapon of that magnitude, a creature like that, they weren't one-offs. Someone or something had a purpose for all of it. Kane stood up from his chair and faced his crew. Which is why we're not done yet. I want a full debrief as soon as we dock at the nearest outpost. We need to put together everything we have on that station, the creature, the weapon, all of it, and send it up the chain. If there's more of those things out there, we need to be prepared. Baylor raised an eyebrow. You think Command will actually listen this time? Kane smiled faintly. They will. They'll have no choice. Henning tapped a few buttons on his console. I've already set a course for Outpost 47. We'll be there in a few hours. Good, Kane replied, settling back into his chair. Let's get some rest while we can. We've earned it. The bridge fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound. Kane's mind wandered as the stars passed by, his thoughts a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. They had survived this mission by the skin of their teeth, but there was no telling what lay ahead. Hours later, as the Resolute approached the outpost, the comms crackled to life. Unidentified vessel, this is Outpost 47. State your purpose. Kane leaned forward and pressed the comms button. This is Captain Kane of the Resolute, requesting permission to dock. We've got high-priority intel for Command. There was a brief pause before the voice responded. Permission granted, Captain. Docking Bay 3 is open. The Resolute glided into the outpost docking bay with a gentle hiss, its landing gear touching down with a satisfying thud. Kane and his crew disembarked, their boots echoing through the metal corridors as they made their way toward the command center. As they entered the debriefing room, they were greeted by a high-ranking officer, her face grim as she took in the sight of Kane's battle-weary crew. Captain Kane, she said, her voice sharp. I hear you've got something important for us. Kane nodded and handed her Baylor's helmet. Everything's on here. You're going to want to see this. The officer took the helmet and motioned for them to follow her. They entered a secure room, where she plugged the helmet into a terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying the footage of the station, the creature, and the weapon. As the officer watched, her face grew pale. When the recording ended, she turned to Kane, her eyes wide with shock. This changes everything. Kane crossed his arms. That's what I was afraid of. The officer stood up, her expression hardening. I need to get this to Command immediately. We'll mobilize our best teams to investigate further. But you, she looked at Kane and his crew, you've done enough. You're going to be debriefed and then put on leave. You've earned it. Baylor let out a low whistle. Leave? Now that's a reward I can get behind. Kane chuckled, but his thoughts remained elsewhere. Leave might be a temporary reprieve, but he knew in his gut that this was far from over. They'd provoked something ancient, something powerful, and humanity wasn't the only species in the galaxy anymore that was playing for keeps. As the officer left the room, Kane turned to his crew. "Get some rest, boys. But stay ready. We've got a long road ahead of us." Henning grinned, shaking his head. "You never know when to quit, do you, Captain?" Kane smirked. "Not until the galaxy's safe." Baylor leaned back, his hands behind his head. "Here's hoping we survive long enough to see it." Kane stood up and stretched, looking out through the viewport at the distant stars. They had struck back against the unknown and lived to tell the tale. But deep down, Kane knew the real war was just beginning. Kane sat in the darkened briefing room, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The display in front of him flickered, showing endless streams of data, but none of it made any sense, not yet. Anyway, he drummed his fingers on the cold metal table, his mind running through the same questions again and again. It had only been a month since their last mission, the mission that had almost cost them their lives. But they weren't free of it, not yet. Far from it. A door hissed open behind him, and he straightened as Henning and Baylor entered. Henning looked just as tired as Kane felt, dark circles under his eyes, while Baylor, as usual, carried a smirk that barely concealed his frustration. "So, what's this about, Captain?" Baylor asked, throwing himself into a chair across from Kane. "I thought we were on leave." Kane glanced at the two of them, then at the display screen. "Command thinks otherwise," he muttered. He tapped a button on the panel in front of him, bringing up a visual one they were all too familiar with. The remnants of the ancient station they'd destroyed. "Please tell me that's an old image," Henning said, leaning forward, his voice tinged with disbelief. Kane shook his head. "It's not. They detected a new anomaly. Same place. Same signature." Baylor groaned. "Of course. The damn thing's back." "No." Kane's voice was hard. "It's worse." The screen shifted to show a series of energy readings, sharp spikes, erratic bursts, and something much larger in scale than anything they'd encountered before. Henning's brow furrowed as he studied the readings. "That's impossible." Kane exhaled sharply. "Command thinks we didn't just stumble on a station. We woke something up." They'd only just begun to understand the scope of what had happened. The destruction of the station had been a mere trigger, a signal to something far older and more dangerous. The station hadn't just been a relic of a forgotten past, it had been a beacon, and now the Guardians had heard its call. "Guardians," Henning repeated, his voice skeptical. "Is that what we're calling them now?" Baylor raised an eyebrow. "Sounds a bit grandiose for something we blew up." Kane stood and crossed his arms, his gaze hard. "It's the name Command's giving them. Apparently, they've been picking up chatter, some kind of old alien code from deep space. It's how they're referring to themselves, the Guardians." He walked around the table, his mind racing. "We've been going through the data we recovered from the station's logs. What we've pieced together so far is that these Guardians are an ancient race, long dormant. The station was one of their outposts, a relay, if you will." Baylor leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "So when we blew it up, we triggered a response," Kane finished. "We woke them up." Henning sighed and rubbed his temples. "And now what? They're just coming for us." Kane's jaw tightened. "Not just us. They're mobilizing across the entire galaxy. We've intercepted reports from fringe colonies, entire systems going dark, ships vanishing without a trace. The Guardians are moving, and they're wiping out everything in their path." Baylor's smirk faded. "Hell." Henning's face paled. "How long do we have?" Kane glanced back at the screen, which now displayed a map of the known galaxy. Several red markers glowed ominously, representing systems already lost. "We don't know. Command's been tight-lipped, but from what I've gathered, we have weeks at most before they're in our space. Days before they reach the outer colonies." A heavy silence filled the room, each of them processing the enormity of what Kane was saying. They were dealing with an enemy unlike any they had ever faced, an enemy with technology so advanced they barely understood it, and one with no apparent motive other than annihilation. "What's our play here, Captain?" Baylor asked, his voice unusually serious. Kane stared at the map, his mind already working through the options. "Command is mobilizing every available fleet to the fringe worlds. They want us to hold the line." Henning snorted bitterly. "Hold the line against what? We don't even know what these Guardians are fully capable of." "That's where we come in," Kane said. "We're going back to where it all started." The Resolute dropped out of hyperspace, the once familiar view of the distant star system, now a battlefield in waiting. Kane sat in his command chair, his eyes fixed on the viewport as they approached the coordinates of the destroyed station. Except it wasn't destroyed anymore. "What in the—" Henning started, his voice trailing off as the massive structure loomed ahead of them. Where there had once been ruins and debris, now stood a fully rebuilt station, larger, more imposing, and surrounded by a fleet of alien ships. Baylor let out a low whistle. "They rebuilt the damn thing." Kane's eyes narrowed. "No, they never needed to rebuild it. That wasn't just a station we destroyed, it was a relay, a piece of something bigger." As they drew closer, the sensors on the Resolute began to pick up unusual energy signatures, readings that didn't match anything in their database. Kane's mind raced. The Guardians weren't just using technology, they were the technology. The station was part of a vast, interconnected system, something far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. "This isn't just an outpost," Henning said quietly. "It's a node. They've spread across the galaxy using these stations as conduits." Kane clenched his fists. "And we're in the middle of their territory." Just as they began to formulate a plan, the comms crackled to life. "Unidentified human vessel, you are trespassing on Guardian territory. Leave now, or be destroyed." The voice was cold, mechanical, but there was something unsettlingly organic about it as well. Kane's heart raced as he responded. "This is Captain Kane of the Resolute. We mean no harm. We seek to negotiate." There was a brief pause before the voice replied. "Negotiation is unnecessary. Humanity will be assimilated or eradicated. You have been warned." The comms cut off, and suddenly the station's defenses activated. Dozens of ships emerged from the shadows, surrounding the Resolute. Baylor cursed under his breath. "I guess negotiation's off the table." Kane's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, entrapped. But something about the station, the way the Guardians had reactivated, it was off. There had to be a weakness, something they could exploit. "Scan the station," Kane ordered. "Look for anything, any pattern or anomaly we can use." As Henning worked the controls, Kane's thoughts drifted back to the mission logs. The Guardians weren't invincible, they had been dormant for a reason. Something had kept them at bay for millennia. "We'll find a way," Kane muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Kane's fingers tapped against the console, anxiety coursing through him as the scanner results began to filter in. Each line of data was a potential lifeline, a way to understand the enemy they were up against. The glowing readouts danced across the screen, but what caught his eye was an anomaly in the energy signatures surrounding the station. "Got something," Henning exclaimed, his voice breaking the tension. "There's a fluctuation in their energy output. It's intermittent, like they're cycling through different states." Kane leaned closer, trying to make sense of the data. "Could it be a weakness?" Baylor interjected. "Or a trap? They could be luring us in, trying to get us to strike at something we shouldn't." Kane considered this. "Maybe, but it could also mean they're still adjusting to the situation. If they've only just reactivated, they might not be at full strength." "What's our move, Captain?" Henning asked, glancing at the ships gathering outside, their metallic forms gleaming ominously. Kane took a deep breath. "We need to test that fluctuation. If we can create a diversion, we might be able to slip through. Head toward the outer edge of the station far enough to avoid their defenses, but close enough to keep monitoring." As the Resolute maneuvered carefully, the crew remained on high alert. The tension was palpable, each member acutely aware of the stakes. The Guardians, as formidable as they were, had awakened an instinct in Kane, a drive to protect his crew and humanity itself. "Hold steady," Kane instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. The Resolute glided past the line of Guardians, their ships hovering like dark shadows. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed as an enemy vessel broke away from the formation, its weapon systems primed. "Evasive maneuvers," Kane shouted, gripping the arms of his chair as the Resolute swerved sharply. Energy blast whizzed past them, the air thick with tension. "Henning, can we counterattack?" "Not yet. We need to analyze the pattern." Henning's fingers danced over the console, his focus unwavering. Baylor's voice cut through the din. "I can't hold this course forever. They're gaining on us." Kane's mind raced, calculating their options. They were outgunned, but the Guardians were a new player in the game of war, and Kane had learned one thing: sometimes a little chaos could yield surprising results. "Divert all power to the forward shields," Kane commanded. "Prepare to charge the main cannon on my mark. We're going to make them think we're retreating." "Are you insane?" Baylor protested, his eyes wide. "That's a death sentence." Kane locked eyes with his friend, determination solidifying his resolve. "It's our best chance. We need them to chase us. When they're in range, we'll strike." The Resolute veered away, putting distance between itself and the pursuing Guardian ship. Kane watched the distance on the scanner, his heart pounding as the enemy ship hotly pursued them, its energy readings rising. The Guardians were relentless, their determination evident in the way they engaged, not wanting to let their prey escape. "Distance holding steady," Henning reported, his voice calm even under pressure. "They're not backing off." "Good," Kane said, his eyes locked on the scanner. "Hold position. Prepare to engage on my command." The ship's hull thrummed beneath them, and the sound of approaching enemy vessels sent adrenaline coursing through Kane's veins. He could feel the crew's anxiety, their fear mirrored in the tension that gripped the bridge. "Now!" Kane shouted, and he slammed a button on the console. The Resolute spun around, its main cannon firing a concentrated blast of energy toward the Guardian ship. The shot struck true, the darkness of space with an intense explosion that sent debris flying. "Nice shot," Baylor exclaimed, but there was no time to celebrate. The damaged Guardian ship was quickly righting itself, its weaponry locking onto the Resolute. "Evasive maneuvers," Kane yelled again, but this time his heart sank as he saw the enemy ships starting to converge. They had anticipated their counterattack, and now they were circling like vultures. "Reinforcements!" Henning shouted, and Kane's heart leaped. "From where?" Kane demanded, scanning the viewport. A fleet of ships burst from the nearby star cluster, human vessels, sleek and fast, armed to the teeth. Command had sent backup, but it wouldn't be enough if they didn't act fast. "Fire the flares," Kane commanded, and the Resolute unleashed a barrage of bright, colorful flares into space, lighting up the surrounding area and confusing the Guardian targeting systems. "Now, focus fire on the damaged ship," Kane ordered. The crew responded quickly, their training kicking in as they executed his orders. The Resolute fired again, this time with the added support of the reinforcements. Underscore 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 underscore. As the battle raged on, the tide began to turn. The Guardians were fierce, their ships powerful, but humanity's tenacity shone through. Kane watched as enemy ships began to fall, one after another. The Guardians were not invincible, they were formidable, but they could be beaten. "Captain," Henning shouted, breaking through the chaos. "We've got another anomaly coming through the sensors. It's larger than the first one." Kane's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" Henning's fingers flew over the controls. "I don't know, but it's definitely a new ship, a Guardian flagship, I think." "Are they retreating?" Baylor asked, hope tinging his voice. "Not likely," Kane muttered, his instincts telling him the opposite. "Prepare for the worst." The flagship emerged from the chaos, a massive structure that dwarfed the other vessels. Its surface shimmered with an otherworldly energy, and Kane could feel its presence even from a distance. "Captain," Henning shouted, urgency coloring his tone. "It's emitting a pulse. We're losing systems." Kane felt the ship tremble as the flagship released a shockwave, knocking out several of their systems and destabilizing the battle. "Stabilize. Get us back on course," Kane barked, gripping the armrest of his chair as the Resolute lurched. But it was too late. The pulse spread, cascading through the battle, disorienting both their ships and the Guardians. Baylor's voice cut through the chaos. "We can't hold this line. We need to regroup and—" "Regroup," Kane snapped, eyes blazing. "We can't just run. Not now." The flagship loomed ever closer, the shadows of its presence swallowing the smaller ships whole. Kane's thoughts raced as he desperately searched for a way to turn the tide again. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. "We have to take that flagship out. If we can disrupt their command, we might just create an opening." Baylor looked at him incredulously. "You can't be serious." Kane's eyes locked onto the viewfinder, determination hardening in his voice. "If we can exploit the anomaly in their energy signatures we detected earlier, we might have a chance. We just need to draw them in." Henning blinked. "It's risky. If we fail—" Kane cut him off. "We won't fail." He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and understanding that he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his crew, to protect humanity. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for their future. "Henning, I need you to monitor the fluctuations closely. Baylor, prepare the maneuvering thrusters. We'll draw their fire and hit them where it hurts. Let's show them what humanity can do." The Resolute creaked and shuddered as the Guardian flagship loomed in the distance, an imposing monolith against the backdrop of space. Kane's mind raced. Time was slipping away, and the window of opportunity was closing fast. They had to strike hard and fast if they were going to take down this behemoth. Baylor's voice was a steady presence beside him. "Maneuvering thrusters are ready, Captain. We can make our move on your mark." Henning was hunched over his console, fingers flying across the interface. "I'm monitoring the energy fluctuations. They're becoming more frequent. We'll need to hit them during the next cycle." Kane glanced at the countdown timer. 10 seconds until the next energy pulse. 10 seconds to position themselves perfectly, and 10 seconds to risk it all. "We're going in," Kane said, his voice a hard edge of steel. "On my signal, we accelerate and fire." The crew braced themselves as Kane's hands gripped the controls. The Guardian fleet, with their ominous ships still looming in formation, had been disrupted by the earlier battle. They were still strong, but now they were vulnerable. Kane wasn't going to let this chance slip through his fingers. 5 seconds, Henning called out, eyes fixed on the fluctuating readouts. Kane's heart raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. The moment was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the moment when everything would hang in the balance, when victory or defeat would be determined in an instant. The ship surged ahead, weaving through the chaotic battlefield as Kane focused on the flagship, its massive form drawing closer. He could see the intricate designs on its surface, pulsating with energy, a stark reminder of what they were up against. With every second, the energy readings from the flagship rose, a harbinger of the destructive force they were about to unleash. "Firing thrusters now," Baylor shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The ship twisted and turned, and Kane felt a rush of exhilaration as they executed the maneuver flawlessly. "Hold steady," Henning's voice was tense. "We're entering the energy field now." Kane's eyes narrowed as he locked onto the pulse patterns on his screen. The fluctuating energy waves formed a chaotic rhythm, and he knew that timing was crucial. They had to hit at the precise moment when the flagship's defenses were at their weakest. "Now, fire," Kane commanded. The Resolute unleashed a concentrated burst of energy straight at the flagship, the beam slicing through the darkness of space like a knife through butter. The moment the energy struck, there was a blinding flash, a shock wave that reverberated through the area, sending ripples across the battlefield. The Guardian flagship shuddered as the energy blast impacted, its shields flaring in response. But Kane's instincts had been right. The blast disrupted the flagship's systems, causing a cascade of failures that echoed throughout the enemy formation. "Yes, we're in," Henning shouted, exhilaration punctuating his words. "The flagship's shields are down. They're vulnerable." Kane felt a surge of hope. "Push forward. Target their command center. Let's take them out before they recover." As the Resolute closed in, they could see the chaos unfolding on the flagship. Guardian ships were spinning out of control, and others began to retreat, a clear sign that the tide was turning. Kane could feel the exhilaration in the air. This was the moment they had fought for. Suddenly, the flagship's remaining defensive systems roared to life, returning fire with furious intensity. Energy beams shot out, scorching the space around them. "Evasive maneuvers," Kane barked. "Get us out of the line of fire." Baylor expertly piloted the ship, weaving through the incoming blasts. The Resolute shuddered as one beam grazed their hull, alarms blaring as the shields flickered under the strain. "We can't take many more hits like that," Henning shouted, his fingers flying over the controls to reroute power to the shields. Kane's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the enemy ships counterattack. They were still formidable, even with their command structure in chaos. "We need to end this now." "Henning, is there any way to pinpoint their command center?" "Yes, but we'll need to break through their outer defenses first," Henning replied, glancing nervously at the readouts. "Then let's give them a reason to focus on us," Kane said, determination hardening his voice. "Baylor, get us alongside that flagship. We'll be the distraction they can't ignore." Baylor nodded, his expression fierce as he maneuvered the ship with precision. "On it, Captain. Just hold on." The Resolute surged forward, dodging blasts and weaving through debris as they made their way to the side of the flagship. Kane could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, the thrill of battle igniting his spirit. "Target their weapon systems. Fire at will," Kane commanded. The crew unleashed a barrage of fire upon the flagship, beams of energy streaking through space as they focused their fire. Each shot landed with precision, causing visible damage and disruption to the massive vessel. "Direct hit," Henning called out, his excitement palpable. "We've breached their outer defenses." "Keep pushing. We need to create enough chaos to breach their command center," Kane shouted, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness. But the Guardians were not giving up easily. The flagship began to regain its composure, and more ships were rallying around it, forming a defensive perimeter. Kane could see the tide beginning to turn again, and they needed to act fast. "Captain," Henning's voice broke through the din of battle. "I'm detecting a surge of energy from the flagship. They're preparing to counterattack." "Get us out of the line of fire," Kane shouted, but it was too late. The flagship unleashed a devastating pulse of energy that erupted outward, engulfing everything in its path. The Resolute rocked violently as the pulse slammed into them, throwing the crew against their harnesses. Alarms blared, and Kane struggled to regain control as systems began to fail around him. "Damage report," he yelled, his heart racing. Henning's fingers flew over the controls, panic creeping into his voice. "Shields are down to 20%. We're losing propulsion. If we don't get out of here..." Kane gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. "We're not done yet. We can't let them take us down here. We need to fight." With a surge of determination, he reached for the controls, pushing the Resolute forward even as the ship shuddered under the strain. They were in the eye of the storm now, surrounded by enemy ships and the overwhelming might of the flagship. "Baylor, get us closer to their command center. We're going to board," Kane shouted, a plan forming in his mind. Baylor's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Trust me, if we can get aboard that flagship, we can disrupt their command structure from the inside." "It's our only chance," Kane said, conviction ringing in his voice. "Fine, but you owe me for this," Baylor shot back, his hands gripping the controls tightly as he navigated the chaos. Underscore 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 underscore. They drew closer to the massive flagship, its hull shimmering with energy. As they approached, Kane could see the entry points along the side, heavily guarded by swarming Guardian ships. But they had already created enough chaos. Now it was time to capitalize on it. "Prepare for boarding," Kane shouted, adrenaline surging through him. "On my mark." The Resolute swerved sharply, aligning itself with one of the entry points. The energy from the flagship pulsed ominously around them, but Kane was undeterred. "Now," he shouted, and Baylor sent the ship barreling toward the opening. The Resolute slammed into the entry point of the Guardian flagship with a loud, metallic screech. Kane felt the ship lurch as the docking clamps engaged, and the hiss of the airlock ceiling echoed through the vessel. His pulse raced as he strapped on his tactical gear, knowing that the next phase of this mission would be the most dangerous. "Boarding team, ready up," Kane called out as he grabbed his pulse rifle from the weapons rack. He glanced over at Baylor, who was already armed and geared up. The pilot gave him a grim nod, adjusting the straps of his armor. "Henning, you're in charge of maintaining comms and control while we're inside. Keep us connected," Kane instructed, locking his helmet into place. Henning, seated at the console, looked anxious but focused. "You got it, Captain. I'll keep an eye on everything from here. Just get back in one piece." Kane gave him a firm nod before turning to Baylor. "Let's move. We've got a flagship to take down." The boarding team made up of Kane, Baylor, and 5 other seasoned fighters assembled at the airlock. As the door slid open, the team stormed into the Guardian flagship, weapons raised and ready. The corridor was dimly lit, with the hum of alien technology vibrating through the walls. Baylor scanned the area with his rifle. "No immediate contacts, but we're deep in enemy territory. Keep your guard up." Kane led the way, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the flagship. Every step was a reminder of the alien presence surrounding them. The architecture was sleek and imposing, with sharp angles and pulsing energy lines running through the walls. It was a stark contrast to human design, a visual representation of the vast technological gulf between the two species. But humans were here, and they were here to win. "Which way to the command center?" Baylor asked, his voice low but tense. Kane pulled up the schematics Henning had provided. "It's on the upper deck. We'll need to take that lift ahead. Stay sharp. They're bound to know we've boarded." As they approached the lift, the air around them seemed to hum with growing intensity. Kane could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "They're coming," he said, raising his rifle and signaling the team to take defensive positions. The next moment, Guardian soldiers poured into the corridor from hidden access points. They moved with eerie precision, their bodies sleek and armored, weapons gleaming in the low light. Their glowing eyes fixed on the human intruders as they advanced without hesitation. "Open fire," Kane yelled, squeezing the trigger of his pulse rifle. The corridor erupted into chaos as plasma bolts and energy beams flew through the air. The Guardians were fast, but Kane's team was faster, using their agility and tactical experience to outmaneuver the enemy. Baylor's shots were lethal, taking down several Guardians in quick succession. One of the aliens lunged at Kane, its blade like appendage slashing through the air. Kane sidestepped, dodging the attack before delivering a well-placed shot to the creature's chest. The Guardian soldier collapsed with a metallic thud, its body twitching as energy dissipated from its armor. "Push forward," Kane shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. The team advanced, cutting down the Guardian soldiers with precision and determination. But Kane knew this was only the beginning. The deeper they went, the more resistance they would face. They reached the lift, the bodies of fallen Guardians littering the floor behind them. Baylor quickly accessed the controls, activating the lift with a sharp clang. "We're in," Baylor said. "Let's go." The lift ascended with a gut-churning lurch, carrying them to the upper deck where the command center awaited. As they rose, Kane's mind raced with the possibilities. Once they reached the command center, they could disable the flagship systems, turn the tide of battle for good. But there was still the unknown factor: the Guardian leader. If they were to win, they needed to confront the one pulling the strings. The lift doors slid open, revealing a wide chamber bathed in an ominous, pulsing light. At the far end of the room stood the command center, its vast array of controls flickering with alien symbols. But what drew Kane's attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was taller than the other Guardians, its body sleek and refined, exuding authority. Its eyes burned with an intense glow as it turned to face the intruders. "That's the leader," Baylor muttered under his breath. The Guardian leader stepped forward, its voice resonating through the chamber in a deep, guttural tone. Kane didn't need to understand the language to know what it was saying. It was a warning. "Spread out," Kane ordered, his voice steady despite the tension rising in the air. "This is it." The Guardian leader raised its arm, and the walls of the chamber shifted. Panels slid open, revealing rows of drones that whirred to life, hovering menacingly above them. Kane's pulse quickened. This was going to be the toughest fight yet. Without waiting for another moment, the drones shot forward, their weapons primed. Kane fired, taking down 2 in quick succession, but more kept coming. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and the high-pitched whine of the drone's energy blasts. Baylor rolled to the side, avoiding a drone's attack before launching a grenade at the nearest cluster of enemies. The explosion ripped through the chamber, sending drones crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. But the Guardian leader remained calm, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Kane knew that if they didn't act fast, they would be overwhelmed. He needed to take out the leader, and fast. "Cover me," Kane shouted, sprinting toward the leader. Baylor and the rest of the team opened fire, drawing the attention of the drones as Kane closed the distance. He could feel the heat of the battle around him, but his focus was unshakable. This was the moment. The Guardian leader's eyes locked onto Kane as he charged, and for a split second, Kane saw something unexpected: recognition. The alien seemed to hesitate, just for a moment, as if it understood the gravity of this encounter. But Kane didn't hesitate. With a roar, he launched himself at the leader, bringing his rifle up for a point-blank shot. The leader moved with blinding speed, deflecting Kane's strike with a sharp, metallic appendage. But Kane was faster. He shifted his weight, using the momentum to drive a knife into the leader's side. The alien let out a guttural hiss, stumbling back as energy pulsed erratically from the wound. Kane didn't give it a chance to recover. With a final, decisive strike, he brought his pulse rifle down on the leader, the energy blast tearing through its armor. The leader crumpled to the ground, its body twitching as the light in its eyes faded. The room fell silent, the drones powering down as the command center systems flickered and went dark. Kane stood over the fallen leader, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He looked around at his team, all of them battered but alive. "It's over," Kane said, his voice rough but triumphant. Baylor walked up beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. "We did it." Kane nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. But there was still work to be done. They had taken down the flagship's command structure, but the rest of the Guardian fleet was still out there. "Let's get back to the Resolute," Kane said. "We've still got a war to win." The crew of the Resolute made their way back through the alien ship, the adrenaline of battle wearing off as the enormity of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. Each step felt heavier now, but there was a glimmer of hope, a hope that hadn't existed just hours before. Kane led the way, his pulse rifle still gripped tightly in his hands. The corridors were eerily silent now, devoid of the Guardian soldiers that had once swarmed them. The darkness of the ship felt less oppressive, but he knew better than to let his guard down. They were still in the belly of the beast, and victory wasn't assured yet. As they reached the airlock where they had entered, Baylor checked his communicator. "Henning, you copy?" A moment of static crackled through the line before Henning's voice came through. Loud and clear. "Baylor, you guys all right?" "We're coming back," Baylor replied. "Mission accomplished." Henning's relief was palpable even over the crackling comms. Good to hear. I've got some bad news, though. The Guardian fleet's not letting up. We're getting hammered out here. Kane clenched his jaw. They had taken down the flagship's command structure, but the Guardian fleet hadn't scattered like they'd hoped. Instead, it seemed the remaining ships were doubling down, desperate to finish what their leaders had started. How long do we have? Kane asked as the team hurried through the ship's airlock and back into the Resolute. Not long, Henning replied grimly. Shields are at 30%. We won't last much longer if they keep this up. Kane turned to his team as they began to strip off their armor and gear. We're not done yet. We've bought ourselves some time, but we need a way to end this fight once and for all. Baylor frowned. The Guardian fleet is still out there. Even without their leader, they're going to keep coming at us. We're running out of options. Kane paced the command deck, his mind racing. They'd come so far, fought so hard, but the odds were still against them. If they didn't find a way to neutralize the Guardian fleet, humanity's last hope would die with the Resolute. Then it hit him. A crazy idea, but one that might just work. The flagship's power core, Kane said, turning to Baylor and the others. We didn't destroy it. If we can trigger a controlled overload, we might be able to take out the entire fleet in one shot. Henning's voice crackled over the comms. You're talking about setting off a chain reaction? That's risky. If it doesn't work, we'll be caught in the blast. It's the only way, Kane insisted. We can't take them all down in a straight-up fight. But if we overload the flagship's core, it'll take out every ship in the fleet within range. Baylor was silent for a moment, considering the plan. It's a long shot, but it might be the only shot we've got. Kane nodded. Henning, patch into the flagship systems. We need to figure out how to set off the core remotely. Henning worked quickly, his fingers flying over the console. Give me a second. All right, I've got it. There's a failsafe in place, but I think I can override it. You'll need to be at the flagship's control station to initiate the sequence, though. Kane grimaced. They would have to go back. Let's gear up, Kane said, already moving toward the armory. This isn't over yet. The team suited up once more, their exhaustion pushed aside as they prepared for the final leg of their mission. Kane felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. If they failed now, everything they'd fought for would be lost. But if they succeeded, they could end the Guardian threat for good. The airlock hissed open, and the team stepped back onto the Guardian flagship. The once active corridors were now eerily quiet, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound. The bodies of fallen Guardians still littered the ground, a grim reminder of the battle they had fought to get here. Stay alert, Kane whispered as they moved through the ship's twisting passageways. We don't know if there are any reinforcements. They made their way to the control station, the large chamber still dominated by the fallen body of the Guardian leader. Kane suppressed a shudder as he approached the command console, Henning's instructions playing over his communicator. All right, Captain, Henning's voice crackled in his ear. You're going to need to disable the safety protocols on the core before you can initiate the overload. I've patched into the ship's systems and can guide you through it, but it's going to take time. We don't have much of that, Kane muttered, his eyes scanning the chamber. The core was below them, accessible through a hatch in the center of the room. He could feel the pulsing energy emanating from it, an almost tangible presence in the air. Baylor stood watch at the door, his rifle raised and ready. You focus on the core, Kane. I'll cover you. Kane nodded, crouching by the control console and getting to work. Henning guided him through the process, each step bringing them closer to the moment of truth. Sweat dripped down Kane's forehead as he worked, his fingers moving over the alien controls with precision. Almost there, Henning said. Just one more sequence. Suddenly, Baylor stiffened. We've got company. Kane glanced up just in time to see a squad of Guardian soldiers storming into the chamber. Baylor opened fire, taking down the first few, but more kept coming. Kane, we've got to move, Baylor shouted, his voice strained. Kane worked faster, his heart pounding in his chest. The console beeped, and the final sequence was entered. "It's done," Kane yelled, jumping to his feet. "Get to the airlock." Baylor nodded, tossing a grenade to cover their escape. The explosion rocked the chamber, giving them the opening they needed to bolt for the exit. Guardian soldiers pursued them through the corridors, plasma blast whizzing past their heads. They reached the airlock just as the core began to destabilize, the ship shuddering violently beneath their feet. Kane slammed his hand on the control panel, sealing the door behind them as they rushed back to the Resolute. "Henning, we're coming in hot," Kane barked into the comm. "Get ready to punch it," Henning replied, his voice tense. "This is going to be close." The Resolute detached from the Guardian flagship just as the core went critical. The explosion started as a blinding flash of light, expanding outward in a wave of destruction. Kane watched from the command deck as the entire Guardian fleet was caught in the blast, their ships disintegrating in an instant. The Resolute rocked violently as the shockwave hit, but it held steady. As the light faded, the battlefield was empty. No Guardian ships remained. "We did it," Kane breathed, sinking into his chair. Baylor let out a relieved laugh. "We actually did it." The Guardian threat was over. Humanity had survived. The Resolute limped through the debris field, the vastness of space eerily quiet now that the Guardian fleet had been eradicated. Kane stood at the command console, staring out at the remains of the battle. It was a bittersweet victory. The Guardian fleet was gone, but so were countless human lives. Baylor walked up beside him, his face grim but determined. "We did what we had to. Without that move, the Guardians would have wiped us all out." "I know," Kane replied softly, "but we're not done yet." Baylor frowned. "What do you mean? We destroyed the fleet. It's over." Kane shook his head. "The Guardians were just soldiers, Baylor. There's something bigger out there, something pulling the strings. We've only dealt with the symptom, not the disease." Henning's voice crackled through the comms. "Kane's right. I've been analyzing the data from the flagship systems. There's evidence of a larger entity behind the Guardian forces, something ancient and powerful. The Guardians were just one of its tools." Baylor cursed under his breath. "So we're back to square one." "Not exactly," Henning continued. "I've pinpointed the location of a planet, an outpost that appears to be the source of the Guardians' control. If we can get there, we might be able to figure out who or what is behind all of this." Kane clenched his fists. They had come so far, fought so hard, and now they were faced with another threat. But he knew they couldn't stop now. Humanity had to uncover the truth. "Set a course for the outpost," Kane ordered. "We're going to finish this." The journey to the outpost took several days, the crew using the time to recover from the battle and repair the damage to the ship. The tension aboard the Resolute was palpable. Every member of the crew knew that this mission could very well be their last. But they also knew that they had no choice. If they didn't stop whatever was behind the Guardians, humanity would never be safe. As they approached the planet, Henning brought up a holographic display of the surface. The outpost was hidden deep within a mountainous region, its exact location obscured by powerful energy fields. The planet itself was a barren wasteland, its surface scarred by ancient battles and the remnants of long-forgotten civilizations. "I'm picking up some strange readings," Henning said, frowning at the display. "There's something off about this place. It feels like the energy here is alive, like it's aware of us." Kane glanced at Baylor, who shrugged. "We've seen weirder things." "Prepare for landing," Kane said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "We're going in." The Resolute touched down on the planet's surface with a jarring thud. The air was thick and oppressive, the sky a swirling mass of dark clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The crew disembarked, their weapons ready, as they made their way toward the outpost entrance. The structure was ancient, its walls carved from black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Massive doors loomed before them, etched with strange, alien symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. "This place gives me the creeps," Baylor muttered as they approached the doors. Kane stepped forward, his hand hovering over the door's control panel. Let's find out what's inside. The doors groaned as they slid open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the weight of centuries. As they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed unnervingly through the cavernous space. Henning's voice crackled over the comm. "Be careful. I'm picking up some unusual energy signatures inside. Whatever's in there, it's powerful." Kane nodded, gripping his pulse rifle tightly as they moved deeper into the chamber. Strange machines lined the walls, their purpose unclear, but the energy they emitted was palpable. At the far end of the room, a massive structure dominated the space, a towering obelisk that pulsed with a soft, ominous glow. It radiated an energy that made the hair on the back of Kane's neck stand on end. "What the hell is that?" Baylor whispered, his eyes wide with awe and fear. Henning's voice was tense. "That's the source of the energy I've been picking up. Whatever it is, it's ancient, and it's not just a machine, it's alive." Kane approached the obelisk cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to stay back, but he had to know what they were dealing with. As he reached out to touch the obelisk, a voice echoed through his mind, a voice that was not his own. "You have come far, human, but you are too late." Kane recoiled, his heart racing. Did anyone else hear that? Baylor and the others looked at him, their faces pale. "Yeah, we all did." The voice spoke again, its tone cold and mocking. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The Guardians were merely the beginning. We are the end." Kane gritted his teeth. "Who are you?" The obelisk pulsed, the energy within it growing more intense. "We are the architects of your destruction. We have watched your kind for millennia, waiting for the right moment to strike. Your resistance is futile. The cycle will continue, as it always has." Kane's mind raced. This was the entity behind the Guardians, the force that had been controlling them all along. But he refused to believe that they were powerless to stop it. "We'll see about that," Kane growled, raising his pulse rifle and firing at the obelisk. The energy from his weapon was absorbed by the obelisk, dissipating harmlessly against its surface. The voice laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. "You are nothing but insects, fighting against the inevitable." Kane glanced at Baylor, who was already pulling out a series of explosive charges. "We'll see how inevitable it is when this thing blows sky high." As they set the charges around the obelisk, the voice grew more frantic, its once confident tone now laced with anger. "You cannot destroy us. We are eternal." Kane smirked. "Yeah, well, nothing lasts forever." With the charges set, the team made a hasty retreat back toward the entrance. As they reached the exit, Kane pulled the detonator from his belt. "Let's end this," he said, pressing the button. The explosion rocked the chamber, sending a shock wave of energy that rippled through the planet's surface. The obelisk shattered, its power extinguished in an instant. Kane and the others stood outside, watching as the energy fields around the planet began to dissipate. The dark clouds above them cleared, revealing a star-filled sky. "It's over," Baylor said, his voice filled with relief. Kane nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was something bigger out there, something even more dangerous than the Guardians or the entity they had just destroyed. But for now, they had won. For now, humanity had survived. The relief of the explosion was short-lived. As the dust settled and the strange energy dissipated from the air, Kane's intuition gnawed at him. It was too easy, too quick. The voice in his mind, that ancient presence, felt unfinished. Baylor holstered his weapon, watching the sky clear. "That should buy us some peace, right?" Henning's voice crackled in their earpieces again. "You're not going to like this, but I'm reading something. Beneath the surface." Kane's brow furrowed. "More ruins? Guardians?" "Not exactly." Henning hesitated. "The data I'm pulling, it looks like the planet itself is connected to the obelisk we just destroyed. We might have just severed the head, but the body is still very much alive." Before Kane could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled violently, throwing the team off balance. Tremors shook the land as cracks split the barren surface, revealing molten veins glowing with a foreboding light. From the jagged earth, something enormous began to rise. Baylor steadied himself, eyes wide. What the hell is that? The team turned to see a towering, obsidian structure emerging from the planet's core, its edges lined with jagged metal tendrils, like some enormous, technological beast being born from the depths. The thing pulsed with energy, a sinister hum filling the air. Henning's voice was frantic now. "Kane, that thing isn't a structure, it's a machine, and it's waking up." The towering structure moved, the tendrils slithering across the planet's surface as if it were feeding on the very land. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. It was unlike anything they had encountered before, a fusion of organic and mechanical, a sentient construct connected to the entity they had just thought they defeated. Baylor gripped his weapon tighter, backing away instinctively. "Tell me we've got a plan for this." Kane's mind raced. The explosives that had taken down the obelisk wouldn't touch this thing. They were facing something far older, far more dangerous than the Guardians had ever been. "We need to find its core," Kane said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It's connected to the planet, which means it has to have a control point somewhere. Henning, can you track it?" Henning was already working furiously, his hands flying over the control interface. "I'm trying, but this thing is massive. I'm not even sure it has a singular core. It might be networked across the entire planet." Kane's heart sank. If they couldn't destroy the machine from the outside, they would have to go inside. But that meant diving into the heart of an ancient, alien construct with no guarantee of survival. "We're not leaving without finishing this," Kane said, his resolve hardening. "We've come too far." Baylor's expression was grim but resolute. "You're the boss. Let's do it." Henning's voice cut through the tension. "I'm picking up an access point near the base of the structure. It looks like some kind of maintenance hatch. If you can get inside, you might be able to disrupt the system from within." Kane nodded, motioning for the team to follow him. The ground continued to tremble beneath their feet as they approached the towering machine. The access point Henning had identified was a narrow, jagged opening at the base, barely visible among the writhing tendrils. "This feels like a trap," Baylor muttered as they approached the hatch. "It probably is," Kane replied, "but we don't have another option." With a deep breath, Kane activated the hatch, and the team slipped inside. The interior of the structure was a maze of pulsating machinery and twisting corridors, the walls alive with strange, shifting patterns. The air was thick with the hum of energy, and the deeper they went, the more oppressive it became. "Henning, guide us," Kane said, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm trying to keep track of your location, but the deeper you go, the more interference I'm picking up," Henning replied. "You're going to have to rely on your instincts once you're inside the core." Kane gritted his teeth. Instincts weren't going to be enough. They needed a plan. Baylor glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "This place is alive. It's like the whole thing is watching us." Kane couldn't shake the same feeling. The walls seemed to shift in response to their presence, almost as if the structure itself was reacting to their movements. Every step they took felt like a descent into the unknown. They reached a massive central chamber, the walls lined with intricate, alien machinery that pulsed with an eerie, organic light. At the center of the chamber was a towering pillar of energy, its surface rippling with power. "That's it," Henning's voice crackled in their ears. "That's the core." Kane approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The energy radiating from the pillar was immense, almost too much to comprehend. This was the heart of the machine, the entity's consciousness, its power source. Destroying it would mean destroying the planet, and possibly everything connected to it. "We need to overload the system," Kane said, his mind racing. "If we can disrupt the energy flow, we might be able to shut this thing down." Baylor nodded, pulling out a series of charges. "Let's make it count." As they began setting the explosives, the walls around them shifted violently. The floor trembled, and a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. "Whatever we're doing, it's not happy about it," Baylor muttered. Kane worked quickly, his hands shaking as he armed the charges. They had minutes, maybe less, before the structure reacted. The tendrils that lined the walls began to move, converging on the central pillar, as if the machine was trying to protect its core. "Hurry!" Henning's voice was urgent now. "The system's waking up. You don't have much time." Kane set the last charge, his heart pounding in his ears. "Go! Get out of here!" Baylor hesitated for a split second, then bolted for the exit. Kane followed close behind, the sound of the structure groaning and shifting around them as they raced for the hatch. Just as they reached the exit, the ground beneath them heaved violently, sending them crashing to the floor. The charges detonated in a blinding flash of light, and the world seemed to implode around them. When Kane opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground outside the structure, the air thick with dust and debris. The towering machine was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater. Baylor groaned beside him, coughing as he struggled to sit up. Did we do it?" Kane sat up slowly, his body aching from the explosion. The planet was still, the strange energy that had once filled the air now gone. The machine was destroyed. They had won. But as Kane looked up at the stars, a sense of unease settled over him. This wasn't the end. They had destroyed the machine, but the entity that had controlled it was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And Kane knew it would come for them again. As the dust settled and the immense structure crumbled into oblivion, Kane stood, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The tremors beneath his feet had stopped, the chaotic hum of energy now replaced by an eerie silence. Yet, Kane's instincts screamed that this silence was only the calm before an even greater storm. The ancient presence that had haunted his thoughts felt closer now, no longer just a whisper, but something tangible. Baylor staggered to his feet beside him, breathing heavily, his hand gripping his side where he had hit the ground hard during their escape. That thing, it was alive, wasn't it? Kane nodded, his mind racing. Not just alive. It was the heart of this planet's defense system, but we only destroyed one part of it. The real threat isn't here anymore, it's out there. Henning's voice crackled through their comms, cutting through the tension. "Kane, I've got more bad news." Kane's stomach dropped. "Go ahead." "I've been analyzing the data from the obelisk and the machine you just destroyed. It wasn't just a planetary defense mechanism. That thing was part of a larger network, a vast web of machines spanning multiple planets across this sector of space. I'm picking up signals from at least 3 other planets with similar energy signatures. If what I'm seeing is right, they're all waking up." Baylor let out a low whistle. "So, what, we just kicked the hornet's nest?" "More like we just alerted the entire hive," Kane muttered under his breath. He turned to Henning. "Do we have any way to disrupt the network remotely? Can we prevent the others from activating?" Henning was silent for a moment. Then his voice came back, sounding hesitant. "There's a chance, but it's risky. The network is ancient, and it's hard to pinpoint where the control center is. But based on the data, I think it's located somewhere deep in the core of the primary planet in this system. If you can infiltrate the core and upload a virus to their mainframe, it might be enough to sever the connection and shut the whole thing down." Kane exhaled sharply. "And if we fail? Then every machine in the network will activate, and we'll be dealing with an entire army of sentient constructs. And from what I'm seeing, these machines aren't just defensive, they're offensive, too. They're designed to wipe out entire civilizations." Baylor stared at Kane, his face grim. "So, what's the plan? Are we heading into the belly of the beast, or are we calling in the cavalry?" Kane's jaw clenched. "We don't have time to wait for reinforcements. If we don't stop this now, the entire sector could be wiped out. We're going in." The team ship descended toward the surface of the primary planet, a desolate, inhospitable world covered in jagged rock formations and molten rivers. Lightning crackled in the darkened skies above, and the ground beneath the ship trembled with the energy of the planet's core. It was as if the world itself was alive, pulsing with a malevolent force that seemed to sense their approach. Baylor strapped himself into his seat, glancing out at the chaotic landscape below. "This place gives me the creeps. Feels like we're walking straight into a death trap." Kane sat at the helm, his hands steady on the controls. "We probably are." Henning's voice came through the ship's speakers. "I've pinpointed the entrance to the core facility. It's located near one of the larger volcanic ranges. You're going to have to land close and make the rest of the way on foot. The terrain is too unstable for the ship to land directly." Kane guided the ship down, its thrusters firing as they neared the planet's surface. The turbulence was intense, the ship shaking as it fought against the violent winds and unstable atmosphere. But Kane's hands were steady, his focus sharp. He had done this 1,000 times before, and failure wasn't an option. The ship landed with a heavy thud, the ground beneath them shaking as the molten rivers bubbled and hissed. Kane unstrapped himself and stood, grabbing his gear. Baylor followed suit, his face set with determination. Henning's voice crackled through the comms. "I'll stay in the ship and monitor from here. I'll guide you as best I can, but once you're inside the facility, you're going to be on your own." Kane nodded. "Understood. Let's move." Underscore 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 underscore. The air was thick with heat and ash as Kane and Baylor made their way across the volcanic terrain. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds and lightning. It was as if the planet itself was angry, sensing their intrusion. They reached the entrance to the core facility, a massive, jagged opening carved into the side of a volcanic cliff. The entrance was lined with ancient, alien machinery, its surface covered in strange symbols and glowing lines of energy. The door was sealed, but Henning's voice guided them through the process of bypassing the security protocols. As the door slid open with a heavy rumble, Kane felt a sense of dread wash over him. This was it. They were walking straight into the heart of the machine. The interior of the facility was even more ominous than the exterior. The walls pulsed with energy, the machinery humming with a sinister rhythm. It was as if the entire place was alive, watching their every move. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. "Henning, how much farther to the core?" Kane asked, his voice low. "Not far. Just a few more corridors, and you should reach the main control room." As they rounded a corner, the ground beneath them trembled violently, and the walls around them began to shift. The machinery came to life, tendrils of energy reaching out toward them as if the facility itself was trying to stop them. Baylor cursed under his breath. "Looks like the welcome party's here." Kane drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "Stay sharp. We're almost there." The walls continued to shift and move, the tendrils of energy growing more aggressive as they neared the core. It was as if the facility was trying to protect itself, sensing the threat they posed. Finally, they reached the main control room, a massive chamber lined with intricate, alien machinery. At the center of the room was a towering pillar of energy, pulsing with power. This was the heart of the network, the control center that connected the entire system. Kane wasted no time. He pulled out the device. Henning had given him, a small, compact virus designed to infiltrate the alien mainframe and disrupt its systems. He approached the central pillar, his heart pounding in his chest. As he inserted the device into the control terminal, the walls around them began to tremble violently. The tendrils of energy lashed out, the entire facility shaking, as if it was trying to fight back. Come on," Kane muttered under his breath as the device began to upload the virus. The walls continued to shift, the tendrils of energy growing more aggressive by the second. The entire facility seemed to be coming alive, as if it knew what they were trying to do. Suddenly, the pillar of energy flared, and the entire room was bathed in a blinding light. The ground beneath them shook, and for a moment, Kane thought the entire facility was going to collapse. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The light dimmed, and the tendrils of energy retracted. The facility fell silent. The silence after the chaos was almost deafening, and Kane felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had expected resistance, expected the machines to fight back, but the sudden, eerie calm left an unsettling feeling in his gut. "Is it over?" Baylor asked, his voice low, almost hesitant to break the quiet. Kane checked the device. The virus had finished its upload, and the control panel had gone dark. The network's been severed. The machine shouldn't be able to activate now. Baylor exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging in relief. "I'll take that as a win." But Kane wasn't so sure. His instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right. The control room felt too quiet, too empty for what was supposed to be the heart of an ancient defense system designed to wipe out entire civilizations. The machines had been aggressive, but they hadn't fought back with the ferocity he expected. "It's not over," Kane muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "Something's wrong." Before Baylor could respond, the control pillar in the center of the room flickered back to life. But instead of the chaotic energy that had surrounded it before, the pillar was now calm, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light. Baylor took a step back. Kane, I thought you said the virus would shut this thing down." "It should've." Kane reached for the device, but the moment his hand touched the control terminal, a voice echoed through the room. "Humans." Both men froze, their eyes locking onto the pillar of light as the voice seemed to come from within it. It was cold, mechanical, but there was something ancient in its tone, something that sent a chill down Kane's spine. "You have severed the connection," the voice continued, "but you have not won." Baylor's hand went to his weapon instinctively. "What the hell is that?" Kane's mind raced. "An AI. It must be a failsafe. Something the virus couldn't touch." The voice spoke again, its tone more deliberate now, as if it was addressing them directly. "Your interference has been noted. Your actions have delayed the awakening, but you cannot stop what is coming." Kane's jaw clenched. "What are you talking about? We've already shut down the network. The machines can't activate." The eye's response was almost amused. "The machines were never the true threat. They were merely the first line of defense. The awakening has already begun." The floor beneath their feet began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't the facility's defenses reacting. It was something deeper, something far more powerful. Kane could feel it in the air. The very core of the planet was shifting. "Whatever this thing is," Baylor said, his voice tight, "we need to get out of here, now." Kane didn't argue. He grabbed the device and turned toward the exit. But as they reached the doorway, the eye's voice echoed one last time. "Humanity's reckoning is at hand. You will not survive what is coming." They ran back aboard the ship. Henning's voice crackled through the comms as soon as Kane and Baylor stepped foot inside. "What the hell happened down there? The whole planet's gone haywire." Kane slammed his fist into the control panel, his frustration boiling over. "We did what we came to do, but it wasn't enough. There's an AI controlling everything, and it just woke up. It said the real threat is coming, and we can't stop it." Henning's face appeared on the monitor, his expression grim. "I've been picking up massive energy signatures from deep within the planet's core. Whatever that AI is talking about, it's big, and it's coming online fast." Baylor shook his head. "We need to get out of here. If the planet's about to erupt or something, we won't survive it." Kane nodded. "Set a course back to the fleet. We need to warn them." Henning's fingers flew over the controls, and the ship's engines roared to life. But before they could lift off, the ground beneath the ship trembled violently, and a massive crack split the surface of the planet wide open. The monitors lit up with warning signals as the energy readings spiked off the charts. "Kane," Henning said, his voice tight with urgency, "we've got a problem." Kane didn't need to ask. He could see it on the monitors. From deep within the planet's core, something was rising, something massive and ancient, its energy signature unlike anything they'd encountered before. "Get us out of here, now!" Kane shouted. The ship's thrusters engaged, and they shot up into the atmosphere just as the planet's surface began to collapse. Below them, a massive structure emerged from the molten core of the planet, its size dwarfing anything they had seen before. It was a fortress, an ancient, alien stronghold that had been buried deep within the planet for millennia. Kane stared in disbelief as the fortress continued to rise, its massive spires reaching into the sky. "What the hell is that?" Henning's face was pale as he analyzed the data. "It's the real control center. The machines were just the surface defenses. This is the real threat." The fortress pulsed with energy, and as they watched, it began to emit a powerful signal, sending out a beacon across the stars. Kane's stomach dropped. He didn't need to know what the signal said to understand its meaning. The awakening had begun, and it was summoning something far worse than machines. The ship rocketed through space, putting as much distance between them and the planet as possible. But even as they fled, Kane knew they were running out of time. "Henning, how far does that signal reach?" Henning's hands trembled as he typed. "Farther than we can track. This isn't just a local transmission. It's galactic. Every dormant system in the sector is waking up." Baylor cursed under his breath. "We've got to warn the fleet. If this thing's calling for reinforcements, we'll be outnumbered before we even have a chance to fight back." Kane nodded, his mind racing. The Eye's words echoed in his mind, haunting him. "You cannot stop what is coming." Whatever this new threat was, it was ancient, powerful, and far beyond anything humanity had faced before. But Kane wasn't about to give up. Not yet. He turned to Henning, his voice hard. "Contact the fleet. Tell them everything. We're going to need every ship we've got if we're going to survive this." As Henning relayed the message, Kane turned his gaze to the stars, his jaw set in determination. The fight was far from over. Humanity had faced impossible odds before, and they had always found a way to survive. This time would be no different.